So, as promised, let's get on with the feedback sessions. If I could now invite the facilitators from SDGs 1 to 6 to join me on the stage, please. And just to remind you, I'd like you seated in order so we know which one you're talking about. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Thank you. And I will introduce you once you're seated. So this is a little bit of a maths test for everybody. Oh, we've got a gap. You can move along one, actually, because we've got 7 chairs. Okay, so we have, representing SDG 1, Pedro Concheco, Director of Strategy Policy at the UNDP. Representing SDG 2, we have Jane Badham, Ambassador for the Scaling Up Nutrition Movement. Representing SDG 3, we have Anthony Capon, Professor of Planetary Health at the University of Sydney. Representing SDG 4, we have Eric Folt, Assistant Director General for External Relations and Public Information at UNESCO. Representing SDG 5, Anna Karine Jatfors, Deputy Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific for UN Women. And representing SDG 6, last but not least, Claire Bramley, Global Water Stewardship Manager at WWF International. A gender-balanced panel, everybody, which is just as well, seeing we're talking about SDG 5. Oh, we will do. So, right, I've asked each facilitator to be as succinct as possible. So hopefully you're going to recognize, if you went to their session, what they're talking about. We only have half an hour for the whole panel, so I've asked them to just 3 minutes to say a few words about what went on. And if you remember at the beginning, I set up that challenge, what does business need from government, as one of the things. So Pedro, you're in the hot seat, because you have to show us how it's done.
Thank you.
Okay,
thank you.
let's kick off.
I'll do my best. So 3 quick points. First, that the ambition in SDG 1 is to eradicate, completely eliminate poverty, to leave no one behind. And this marks a sharp distinction with efforts in the past that aimed at eradicating poverty. So we heard from a colleague from Indonesia. Indonesia reduced the poverty rate from 25% in the late 1990s to about 10% today. Remarkable performance. Yet, that means that 30 million people still live in poverty in Indonesia, the population of Malaysia. So this gives us the sense of the challenge that we have in front of us. It's much more ambitious aspiration to eradicate poverty. So what needs to be done? Second point, 2 things emerge from our discussion. First is that we need to reach this last mile of exclusion. These 30 million people living in poverty in Indonesia, and it's difficult. These people have been living in poverty in Indonesia now for a number of years. It's more about chronic poverty. But what the panel showed is that this can be seen as a business opportunity. And we heard from a number of examples of people that are pursuing social enterprises and other inclusive business models, through which businesses are engaging, reaching these people by providing services, by making them part of their value chain, as a core business opportunity, not as corporate social responsibility, not as philanthropy, important as these are. And the second thing that needs to be done is to protect those that are vulnerable, those that have already been able to move beyond the poverty line and are no longer in poverty, but can quickly slide back in poverty because they are still not yet very secure. So we heard, for instance, of something that's happening in Indonesia, where the entity dealing with poverty eradication is working with the Ministry of Health to help people cope, especially with health shocks, because you can be working in a job, so moved out of poverty, but then if you become sick, you can quickly slide back into poverty. And this is interesting and involves businesses, because the kind of activities that are being undertaken involve, for instance, media companies in making messages about the importance of dealing with health, special chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, in a way that enables them to be protected from poverty. So last point, what businesses need from government? 2 things that we heard in our panel. First, provide an enabling environment for businesses to engage with the last mile of exclusion. And second, provide incentives to align business activities with the efforts to eradicate poverty. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Enabling environment and incentives. Thank you. Jane, SDG 2.
So SDG 2 sounds really simple when we say zero hunger, but the discussion was it encompasses so much more. In fact, it's a very big ask. It's about ending hunger, achieving food security, improving nutrition, so the quality of food, and promoting sustainable agriculture. But the problem that was identified is the reality is nutrition is everyone's business, but no one's responsibility. So nutrition often has an ownership issue. Agriculture will tell you it lies with health, health will tell you it lies with social development. So this is really an issue, and that's one of the asks one needs from government, from business, is there needs to be clear ownership of where nutrition lies in order for one to be able to move forward. So what else does business need from government? And also what else should business be doing from here? We looked at it in both ways. The first thing was there needs to be an openness to engage. And that's something that often hasn't been there. There also needs to be a willingness to do things differently, to be prepared to even be disruptive. There was debate over this issue of whether one should trust first or not. And there was beginning to be an agreement that we don't actually have time to build the kind of trust that we often talk about. But that if we set the rules of engagement up front, then there shouldn't be a reason why we shouldn't already engage, and then we can assess and adjust as we go along. There was also then clearly the fact that what we've got to start accepting is celebrating and creating strength through diversity. In the past, partnerships have often been one of compromise to try and make everyone feel satisfied, when in fact no one walks away satisfied. So there was a real feeling that we have to have the difficult discussions, we have to keep going at the groan zone to actually get to the breakthrough point, because it only often comes when you've had that openness and that transparency and that discussion. And finally, what we really remembered is we cannot forget where we come from, which is the MDGs, and the reality that we did not succeed in all. So we can't not learn from this. We can't just simply replace it with the SDGs without learning from what we did in the past. So in conclusion, I'm going to use the words of the Dalai Lama, who said, if you don't reach the goal, don't adjust the goal, adjust the actions. So there was a strong feeling that on SDG 2, we've got to do things fast, we've got to scale up, but we've got to adjust how we've done it if we're going to have a different outcome.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And that thing about rules for engagement is probably quite important in that adjust, right? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Anthony.
Yeah, thanks very much. And perhaps to pick up on the immediate previous speaker in terms of reflecting back on the MDGs, when we think from a human health perspective and we look back at those MDGs, many of them were very specific health outcomes. And so health was heavily engaged in the MDGs, whereas when we look at first glance at the SDGs, it might seem that there's much less emphasis on health, because there's only SDG 3 specifically about good health and well-being. But I think it came through very clearly in our discussions and was emphasized by the Minister for Health from Malaysia that what we need to be about with health is creating healthy environments, places where people can flourish. And so it requires us to work much more effectively across sectors, much more so than when we looked at the MDGs, because they were very specifically about actions that the health system could take, sometimes in isolation. So I think that paints the context for us. Relatedly, health workers like myself, I'm a doctor, we traditionally focus on the health and well-being of people currently alive and about to be born, when we think about maternal health, for example. But the SDGs require us to look over the horizon at the health and well-being of future generations. And this is a very big shift for people across the health sector. And in terms of our business partnerships, it's a big shift as well. So we heard about some fascinating things that have been happening from business, the work that GlaxoSmithKline has been doing on access to medicines in low-income countries. And we spent some time reflecting on antimicrobial resistance, which has now been identified by the UN as a major global health challenge. And our colleagues from Glaxo were discussing the need for new models of funding for research on antimicrobials, because it's not an area where there's usually a lot of money to be made by business. Traditionally, of course, pharmaceutical companies make their money by selling lots of tablets, lots of medications, but that is not always practical with antibiotics, and particularly because many of these diseases are in low-income countries. So there was discussion of the need for new models of financing, perhaps governments investing more on the research side to enable the developmental work to happen. From Mars, from the food system point of view, we learned that Mars was one of the early movers on declining to advertise its products directly to children. But of course, in the context of the internet era, it's challenging to manage that. You know, we can look at television advertising and that sort of thing. It's fairly straightforward, the hours of the day when children might be watching television. But when you're looking at the internet and free-ranging across it potentially, then it's quite challenging to manage that advertising. And from Herbalife, we learned about fascinating new partnerships between the business, the community and government around their nutrition clubs in various parts of the world. So I think lots of innovation there and some important challenges as highlighted by the Minister. Perhaps to finish with the need for in fora like this, for us to focus, at least to some extent, on the interactions across the SDGs. You know, we're going to give feedback principally on them as individual sets of goals and targets, but there's important interactions and the synergies and trade-offs are critical. So perhaps in a future forum, thinking about those interactions.
Great, thank you. And I think we made that point at the beginning that we need to get everyone on the page on the goals. We can then start to talk about the interconnectedness. Yeah. I love your point about Mars and their advertising. Did anybody see the Dolmio advert? The Dolmio pasta sauce done by Mars? Only use this product once a week? Yeah. Really cool. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Eric.
Yes, first of all on SDG 4, perhaps like SDG 3, there's a recognition that there's a lot of work that has already been done, perhaps because of the MDGs, which focus very strongly on education. So to that extent, the various partners probably know what to expect of each other. We had maybe, if I oversimplify, 3 strands to the discussion. First, and I would say foremost, the crucial importance of gender equality to achieve SDG 4, which also makes a link, of course, to the SDG that is specific to gender equality, and the need to accelerate efforts in this area. This is something that is pervasive throughout SDG 4 that I have to underline. There was a lot of talk also about ICT in education for both improving the quality and efficiency of delivery of education, and also preparing our children and youth for the future job market, something that a lot of the private sector companies have a lot to contribute to. And then we talked also about the importance of technical, vocational education and training. Like my colleague, we heard in our panel a lot of very vivid and interesting examples of what is being done by private sector companies. Sonia from Ericsson reminded us, for instance, that in light of the rapidly evolving economy today, education is changing, but must continue to change. And she gave us several examples of her company's engagement. For instance, they have a wonderful project which is called Connect to Learn in Myanmar, with a lot of different partners, including, as it turns out, UNESCO, but it covers some 21,000 students in Myanmar, connecting these schools, providing devices, and much more. Marianne, my colleague from UNICEF, highlighted that in Southeast Asia, countries are increasingly moving towards a service-based economy, which means that there's a need to invest more in what she called the region's cognitive capital. And in doing so, she reminded us that the business community should not see paying for education as a cost, but rather as a strategic and wise investment that will help bring about sustainable business. Holly from Huawei had wonderful examples also. She emphasized the importance of focusing on capacity building for students and teachers in ICT skills and knowledge, and tackling digital illiteracy. She showcased in particular Huawei's project Seed for the Future, which has been providing opportunities to students to learn the available technology and to improve their employability. I think it's present in over 80 countries, engages 300 universities around the world, so that's also a very concrete example. Margarita from the Tanoto Foundation emphasized repeatedly the potential of teachers as the key agent of change in the community, at the community level in order to improve quality and expand access to education for all. She also shared with us the example of the Tanoto Foundation's School Improvement Program, which focuses on teachers' capacity building in teaching and delivering education. We had a representative of the Ministry of Education of Cambodia, Borat Ung, with us, and he gave also a lot of very useful examples. He did note that there was still, of course, there's still much to be done in higher levels of education. He also shared his concern that there's an apparent mismatch between education outcomes and the expectation of the business sector today in Cambodia. He said that the business sector expects very high level of skills, but that education needs to be very labor market oriented. So to conclude, I think all the panelists, regardless of their constituencies, all argued for the need for increased but more strategic investment in education, not only as a fundamental human right, but also for its proven benefits, socioeconomic benefits, and for the sustainable development of society at large.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, sir. I'm getting a theme coming out which is quite interesting, which I'll test with you when we've got through the six of you. Anna Karin.
Thank you. So the panel on SDG 5 noted really the unique opportunity that this goal offers, certainly a huge improvement from the MDGs with a very strong, transformative gender equality goal that really goes to the heart of gender discrimination. But it was also noted that gender equality and women's empowerment are not just crucial development goals in its own right, but really a catalyst and an enabler for all of the other goals. And we've heard other speakers refer to the importance of gender equality. Certainly, unless women are able to participate fully in the economy and society and their communities, we will not be able to achieve a sustainable world. It was also noted that we still have quite a long way to go. You have only half of women in the labor force overall compared to 3/4 of men. And the global gender pay gap has not improved much in recent decades. Women still earning 24% less for their work compared to men. In terms of leadership and decision making, it was also noted that in Asia and the Pacific, we are still behind the global averages, having just less than 1 in 5 parliamentarians being women and around 1 in 10 board members. So still a ways to go. But the panel in particular from our private sector colleagues highlighted that businesses on one hand have a role to play in removing biases in their HR policies, in recruitment, promotion, equal pay, empowering women within the workplace, but even more so to empower women across the value chain. We heard examples from Unilever and Coca-Cola, each of which reaching some 5 million women across their value chains, working with smallholder farmers, working with micro entrepreneurs, female retailers, and so on. Working through those value chains to support women's empowerment, technical upskilling, access to finance, financial literacy, etc. And another emerging theme that was coming up is the linkages with violence against women, ensuring that women are free from violence and exploitation within the workplace, but also in terms of how violence against women can be an impediment for further economic empowerment. The issue of partnerships, I think others have referred to that, came up very strongly between government, CSOs, and the private sector. So we heard an example from the government of New Zealand where government can help create an enabling policy environment, but also to create incentives for the private sectors so that those policies then come alive within businesses and within communities. We heard some great examples of co-creating value-based and shared value models. For example, the Great Women Initiative in the Philippines that is bringing value for women, but also for businesses. I think one issue that came up very strongly is the importance of data. Setting targets, measuring progress towards those targets, There was an interesting example with the W+ standard, which is a model that is quantifying the impact of interventions in climate change, but that creates then greater accountability and transparency, measuring impact not just for women's incomes, but in terms of their time use, in terms of health, education outcomes. So tracking that for transparency was seen as very important. And finally, a related emerging theme that came out across the panel was it's not just enough for empowering women themselves, but we have to do a lot more to address the gender norms and the stereotypes in the environments, whether in the workplace or in the communities where they operate, because this is really where women are still held back. So the panel found that the private sector can do a lot more, not just within the value chains, but also through marketing, their brand work, and so on, to promote positive and healthy ways of being for both women and men, and to build those role models. So yeah, I think this panel showed very clearly that it's a very positive development, not only that change is possible, but change is already happening. And through that change, in fact, we're seeing real and tangible benefits, economic benefits and social benefits, both for women themselves, but also for businesses and society at large.
Brilliant, thank you. So back to that creating shared value, we might talk about that if we get a minute. And finally, Claire.
Thank you. Well, we actually started the day in the plenary session talking about water when you, Malcolm, talked about the importance and relevance of SDG 6 to business, with the easily actionable targets within the goal on water efficiency, reducing pollution and increasing access to sanitation services. And in the discussion we actually carried on another theme from the morning, which was about how action on water, like many of the other SDGs, shouldn't just be a matter of philanthropy or corporate responsibility, but it's actually a matter of business risk and opportunity as well. And we heard a clear message within our session from ANZ Institutional Banking that with the increasing focus on responsible lending, companies are going to be left behind if they don't take action. Ultimately, they're going to face restrictions in terms of the financing options available to them if they don't act. We also spoke about the need for businesses to take action on two levels. So firstly, what business can do internally within their own sphere of influence, but then what they can do collectively, and this comes back to the theme of the conference around collaboration. So first, starting within your own sphere of influence, so operations and supply chains as well. This goes back to things like we spoke about, improving water efficiencies, improving wastewater treatment, improving sanitation facilities. Taking action like this often leads to cost savings as well as risk reduction, as well as supporting the SDG agenda. So really it is a win-win. ACOM gave an interesting example where sludge from wastewater treatment is being used to, it's been used for energy generation, which obviously drives efficiencies as well as supporting a number of the SDG goals. But a crucial part of supporting SDG 6 is about taking action collectively, and the importance of collaboration really can't be underestimated when it comes to water management. So we heard an example from the Jiangsu Engineering and Consulting Center, which is a think tank for the Jiangsu Development and Reform Commission in China. And in their region, there are NGOs and private sector players like multinationals like H&M. They've come together to address the pollution issues that are facing the region, and they're doing that by engaging in multi-stakeholder dialogue, looking at the issues and risks that they're facing in the region, and working together to improve water governance. And this really is the key to, we discussed the key to reducing business risk. We also spoke about PPPs for infrastructure, a kind of different type of collaboration, and the need for governments to really clearly define the roles for different organisations within that. We also touched briefly on the criteria for measuring sustainability of these types of projects as well. And finally, we talked about there's lots of tools and resources out there already for businesses. So if you don't know where to start, we will actually be sharing some of those tools with everyone after the conference so that you can go away building on the momentum of what you've heard and take tangible action in support of SDG 6.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. That was almost 3 minutes. I picked up a common theme, and then I'm going to ask you one question, then we're going to have to break. But the common theme was that actually a lot of it's already happening, just needs to be done more. So I heard about incentives to make things happen more. I heard about adjusting the plan to make it happen better. I heard about new finance to make things happen faster. I heard about strategic investment. I heard about incentives for gender equality, and I just heard about defining roles better for PPPs. So it feels like we've got the ball going in the right direction. We need a bit more action to make things happen faster. The one question I wanted to just pick up on very quickly was Anna-Karin, you mentioned data, and I was very interested this morning at lunchtime that Eric Solheim, at the end of his talk, strayed into the domain of the accountant, which is what I am, and he started talking about reporting and disclosure. Did you, in your workshops, did you talk, obviously you talked a bit about data, but did any of the others have a conversation about business and what they should be reporting and disclosing around your particular goal? Maybe.
Well, we certainly had the point of transparency coming up, and that perhaps one of the needs of business is to also be more transparent. So it's not directly data that we were talking about, but definitely that need for a greater transparency, which I think is very closely connected.
Connected to the reporting, yeah.
Yes, from a health point of view, one of the things that we looked at was the carbon footprint of the health system. And it's been shown that roughly half of the carbon footprint of health systems is accounted for by pharmaceutical medications and medical devices. And so we talked about pharmaceutical companies needing to use approaches like life cycle assessments from a sustainability point of view, so that they really interrogate the footprint through the whole life cycle of the production of that very small tablet. But there's a lot behind that.
A lot behind it, yeah.
Yeah.
And of course there's water as well.
Yeah.
Yes, in our panel we also spoke a lot about data, more from the perspective of governments having data of the people that are being left behind.
Right.
Being able to reach them. And in fact, the challenge sometimes is that the people that are being left behind are not counted at all. So that's a big challenge. This includes populations that are displaced or ethnic minorities in many places around the world.
Did you talk about companies being required to report whether they paid everybody the living wage or the minimum wage?
Exactly. That's also part of the reporting and disclosure. In fact, there was a suggestion that governments could actually certify businesses, this comes from Mark Ingram, could certify businesses as pursuing inclusive business, and if they meet certain criteria, then they could be basically left off the hook in terms of other regulations to enable them to pursue inclusive business.
One of your incentives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Eric, did you have anything? Did you talk at all about?
Data, not so much. I think perhaps because there's already a lot of agreements concerning data in the field of education. It's pretty well charted, so that was not really a topic of discussion.
Well, one of the interesting things that came out in the SDG 5 conversation was the links between data and accountability. So there were some examples, for example, from Unilever where the CEO and having leadership, where the CEO from the very top was saying we have to do much more, and then tracking data and holding all managers accountable for delivering on those results. And that had led to an improvement from women in management from 36% to 45% in just 5 years. And so when you're able to track and then hold managers accountable, so that interplay between data and leadership from the top was seen as a key enabler for accelerating progress.
Very interesting. And of course, Unilever with their sustainable living plan set out a whole lot of things where they put some targets out there. I didn't even know where they were going to get the data from to start with. Very challenging. And what about on?
The data and reporting didn't come up specifically, but I think what we've seen, I've seen in my experience is how disclosure can really help companies to start even understanding what actions they need to take.
Yep.
It's a really good way of being able to look at where the gaps are in your policy and take action. So yeah, definitely.
And in water.
Malcolm, I just want to add something from our nutrition, because I think when we talk data we have to be really careful, because one of the things in nutrition is we know the interventions that work. So there's also a plea, often governments want more data in their context, whereas actually we can apply a lot of the data globally, and perhaps some of what we were also saying, the time now is to move on to action. So I think we have to be very careful when we also are saying, you know, what are we doing for data, is don't let that hamper us moving forward, because in many cases we know what to do. The data must come for measuring our success of whether we're achieving it.
Yeah. And I've been in conversations, too many actually in New York with the UN agencies, where the conversation is all about the data and not about the outcome.
Exactly.
Then we get lost a bit in that.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you very much indeed. That was fantastic. If we could give everybody, if we could all give them a warm round of applause. Thank you very much. Now,